Commissioner Johnston present.
Ballantyne present.
Schwartz present.
Danaher present.
Forstall present.
Trumbull here.
Philseth here.
Excellent. Oral communications, David Carnahan has an announcement for us.
Good evening, Chair Danaher and Commissioners. David Carnahan in the City Clerk's office, and I'm here sharing with you the city's current recruitment for boarding commissions. We are looking to fill 3 vacancies on the Architectural Review Board, 3 vacancies on the Parks and Recreation Commission, and 2 on the Planning and Transportation Commission. And as you know from your service on the UAC, these are fantastic ways to give back to your community, get to know a little bit more about Palo Alto, and really just have an impact on your community. So we're asking each of you to reach out to some community members that you think might be a good fit for the Architectural Review Board, the Parks and Recreation Commission, or the Planning and Transportation Commission. And we're accepting applications through October 17th at 4:30 p.m. and applications are available on the city's website, cityofpaloalto.org/clerk. If you have any questions, just feel free to give us a call, shoot me an email. We'll have flyers given to each one of you, and then for members of the public that are here or watching from home, go online, apply, share this with as many community members as you know that you think would be a good fit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those would be some interesting commissions. So, very good. All right. We have approval of the minutes. I have a small edit, but does anybody else have edits to make to the minutes? All right. Only because it's a sensitive issue, I want to be particular on this one. On page 8, there's a statement from Chair Danaher about the pad mounted versus the other, and there's a phrase that says, because safety is the key criteria, and I think it misrepresents what I said as having reached a conclusion. I would propose to change those words to say, if safety requires it, transformers should be pad mounted, and continue with that sentence. Because right now, I think we still have an open mind on the subject. We're waiting further reports from the staff on those issues. And
so absent any other comments, I'm sorry, AC looks like he has something.
I think there's one on page 5.
all right.
The first full paragraph, the paragraph that starts Commissioner Ballantyne, the last sentence just seems to be, there's a word missing or a typo or something. It doesn't seem to scan.
Oh, probably at the end. Why don't we mark that? So as a word missing for staff to fill in, subject to those changes, is there a motion for approval of the minutes?
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I'm going to hand this over to agenda review. Commissioner Schwartz and I talked with the staff yesterday and agreed that we would move item on the new business, item 3, to come first because we've got some consultants here and let them get out early from the evening, and assume there's no objections with that. Reports from commissioner meetings and events. Dean or?
No,
Oh, Judith, pardon me. I'm thinking utilities report. Yeah.
So I haven't seen you guys in a while, so it's nice to see you. So I have several to report on. So back in June, I led a workshop for the Low-Income Community Solar Working Group back in DC, and I think based on what we're going to be talking about today, that community solar is actually going to become much more relevant, even though it wasn't necessarily, in the context of low income. I think one of the things we've done is we've looked at some different models for how to do it other than a straight subscription. So there might be some things there that are interesting for us to consider. Then the next one is in July, I went to the SEPA Grid Evolution Summit, which is what used to be the National Town Meeting. And so that was, a good event, and we have a lot of interesting speakers that come to it and a lot of sessions that are relevant. And I think the thing that is most relevant for this particular group is that all of the things that we are considering and talking about tonight are sort of really well-established concepts and principles, and there's a whole body of work to draw on. So there's nothing that we're going to do that somebody hasn't thought about or talked about, and there are papers and things like that. So that'll be something that will help us. We're not having to break new ground here. And then next, I hate it. Sometimes computers do not do what you want. Then one of the other things that happened in August, was another more low-income energy issues forum and community solar webcasts. And so again, that we're sort of looking and seeing what the connections are between what else the utility does and what it means for community solar. And I think that's something we need to consider. And I also had the chance I was invited to be a merit reviewer for DOE for grants that were submitted for an FOA to proposals that were sort of $1 million to $5 million to both for various kinds of solar projects and solar plus storage. And it was just a really interesting process to see, while I'm not allowed to talk about anything specific about what was proposed, it was really interesting to see what were the leading edge things that people were applying for grants for. And what are the things that are, and so the whole issue around, we've talked a lot about analytics and what are the kinds of things that you're going to be able to do. And so I think there's some interesting stuff coming down the road that will be really useful. And there were bankers there as part of the reviewers, and so it was very interesting to me, since I tend to hang out with the engineers and the community outreach people and the pricing people. It was really interesting to hear bankers talking about their sense of financing these kinds of projects.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Is there a time on the agenda for us to share comments from the resiliency workshop?
I think we get to commissioner comments. That would be
Okay,
appropriate.
perfect.
General Manager of Utilities report.
Thank you, Chair Danaher. Evening, Commissioners. A couple things to note here tonight. So on July the 6th, the State Water Resource Control Board issued a draft final Bay Delta Plan update known as the Bay Delta Plan. Called for a 40% unimpaired flow of Chilmali River between the months of February and June, regardless of the water supply conditions. To date, this SFPUC and the city water supplier and Bosca, an associated wholesaler water supplier, including Palo Alto, served by San Francisco Public UC, have advocated that the volunteer settlement agreement among affected parties rather than adopting of the 40% unimpaired flow requirements. And then on August 20th, the city held a public hearing to discuss the state's proposals by the Dell plant. The city staff recommended council to support the voluntary negotiated settlement process, and council instead voted unanimously to support the Bay Delta Plan, including the flow criteria. The plan was not yet been adopted, while the state board has originally planned to issue a final decision by August 23rd. Action was delayed allowing more time for voluntary settlements and procedures that the state refers to as an opportunity to make the non-flow elements more concrete and reduce the potential water supply impacts. On August 28th, Palo Alto water supplier and the SFU PUC held a public hearing and heard testimony from advocates, but took no action to change in its position. Another FFPUC hearing was expected at a larger date, and Santa Clara Water Valley Water District, of which the city is part of, also held a public hearing on the 28th for the Bay Delta Plan. The district board voted unanimously to support the volunteer settlement process. So that was an update that was given to and voted upon by the council back on July the 6th. Then tomorrow, Thursday, September 26th, the city will participate in an annual regional disaster exercise known as Urban Shield. And the simulation is an aftermath of a major earthquake. Staffs from utility, public works, public safety, and other city departments operating from the Mobile Emergency Operations Center, which is called a MEOC, collaborate with other regional agencies on a disaster recovery response. The City Council will also proclaim National Emergency Preparedness Month as September the 10th meeting. And a little bit of the insight on that is that it's going to be a preparedness portion of it where it's 4 days in after the earthquake actually started to happen. So we'll be working with the regional judiciaries as well as these other departments, and we'll actually do this exercise tomorrow. To learn more about that, if you go to the City of Palo Alto.org forward preparedness, you'll be able to get a little bit more information about what's going on with that. 3 upcoming events. Midtown Residents Associate City Ice Cream Social. Utility staff will host an informational booth at the annual Midtown Residential Association Ice Cream Social on Sunday, September the 16th. So come out and please join the community at Hoover Park between 1 and 4. That's September the 16th, Sunday, at Hoover Park between 1 and 4. Then another one is that'll happen on the same day. It's electric vehicle ride and drive event. So this has been pretty big in the last few years. We're, again, on the 16th, the city's co-sponsoring an electric vehicle ride and drive event at the Peninsula Convention Center to celebrate National Drive Electric Week. EV owners and dealers will bring out their various zero emissions vehicles instead of driving to the test out, and then you'll find that registration at the cityofpaloalto.org/workshops. That will be happening again on the 16th. Maybe Catherine, if she's here. Do you know the time? Sorry, I don't know the time.
I believe the ride-and drive on Sunday, the 16th, begins at 1 o'clock. All of the details and registration, we actually recommend that people register due to space availability. All of those details are at cityofpaloalto.org/workshops. And that is a co-sponsored event with Actera and in commemoration of National Drive Electric Week.
Thanks, Catherine. And the last thing is SunShares Workshop. So on Saturday, September the 29th, the city is hosting an introduction workshop on SunShares Solar and Zero Emissions Vehicle Program. Attendees can learn more about these technology incentives, benefits, combination of solar and electric vehicles, and then how to access the program groups by discounts. And you can register there again at cityofpaloalto.org/SunShares. So that was my report for tonight.
All right, thank you. Commissioner comments. Arnie, you wanted to start with?
So last Tuesday, we had several of us had the opportunity to join this special resiliency workshop where we went through kind of talked through several different aspects of a similar scenario with a large Hayward Fault earthquake, and then like the Dumbarton Bridge being, maybe out of service for a very long time. It struck me how much the rather esoteric Department of Energy analysis I had seen talking about the N+1+1 redundancy really mattered. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around N+1+1, but it came up a number of times in the workshop where you've had one very significant, horrific event, and some of your hardware survives. That's kind of your N+1, and then you run out of diesel fuel, and it's the +1. And several things I think were striking in the conversations we had on Tuesday, such as, well, if the 101's out of service and it's really hard to truck things in and out, how would we get more diesel fuel? And do we need to make sure that we have appropriate reserves or dual fuel generators? One of the comments that I thought was interesting was that in the scenario, they made the claim that the PG&E natural gas pipeline would be shut off. And as far as I'm aware, in every significant earthquake, the PG&E pipeline is not shut off. It's just locally isolated at leakage points. So again, I think when you think through N+1+1 scenarios, it's probably an asset. Whereas in that particular scenario, it was given to us that it would not be an asset. And the last thing that I really took away as a reflection was, while it seems that we have some very good civic programs around first aid type response, and we were just chatting about that, if everyone who is normally operating the control room for the utility is also facing similar transportation issues, then who closes the breaker to bring the PG&E utility back online into the Palo Alto grid if we're very, very low on people? And who refuels the diesel when we finally get more diesel fuel here at City Hall? And I think those might be things we ought to think about in that N+1+1 type of thing, because I think certainly it's critical to think about day one, but I think day 3 can be just as bad. That's it.
Thank you. Other comments? Terry, you have your light on. You have deep into account. Okay.
I don't have my light
AC, anybody else? All right.
Lisa, you can go first.
The resiliency workshop, if I recall, was in response to a conversation we had been having around, I think it was the additional transmission line, and the desire to sort of like understand how the community thinks about resiliency and what the community values. And I, like Arnie, I thought the workshop was really interesting and illuminated a bunch of sort of interesting properties of our city and our preparedness that I hadn't thought of before. I think it fell a little short of my expectations in terms of listening to the community, just the format, that there were 2 hours of presentations and I think something on the order of 40 minutes to hear the community and their thoughts was unfortunate. And my own, just as a bit of feedback, of the panelist presentations, the city staff seemed to me much more relevant than the consultants. I couldn't figure out why consultants were at a community local.
So I actually want to address that because I was disappointed on a lot of levels. And one of the ways that I was disappointed was that the experts that I was asked to recruit weren't supposed to be giving presentations. They were supposed to be answering people's questions. And it was disappointing to me that it was set up with all those presentations and not a more interactive kind of approach, both for how we used these experts and how we had the community interact with the experts. And I think that it's not enough to schedule meetings for community outreach if you don't design them in ways that really secure the kind of input that you're looking for. And I think having a doomsday scenario where, was so horrible that you should just go home and slit your wrists as the way to survive was not really what I was looking for. I was really looking for something where the city council could understand why we needed to invest in certain things because they would make recovery possible from realistic kinds of things that could happen that were not, the entire region is destroyed. I mean, if you were, doing a Hollywood movie, maybe that was a good scenario to cover, but I don't think from my perspective it was at all what I was seeking and what we had the meetings about and what we had prepped in advance. And so, again, it's not just enough to have meetings. You've got to, they can be designed well or they can be designed poorly. And it's not, to Commissioner Forsell's point, that it's bad to have experts there, but it's bad if you don't use them and they weren't prepped and they weren't told what were issues. So I think that that I think was very unfortunate.
All right.
I was trying to avoid commenting on this because I found every other commissioner's comments germane. So I would just reiterate what was our first comment, Arnie's, which is esoteric. Is that what we're going for here? Thanks.
All right, well, no more commissioner comments. We'll get on to the next item. As we said in the new business, we're changing things around. We'll start with item 3, discussion of the 2019 California Energy Standards rooftop solar. And never mind the comments that were made about consultants a moment ago.
Thank you, Commissioners. Jonathan Aubenshine, Assistant Director of Utility Resource Management. I'd like to introduce a couple of people here. We have with us tonight Melanie Jacobson from Integrated Design 360, a consultant who works regularly with our Development Center, our building division. And I also have in the audience Christine Tam back there, who is our utilities, at least our resource management group's primary liaison with development services and is pretty in touch with the CEC on these types of issues. So she can also be available to answer utility questions.
Okay. So just to remind the commission, we had asked for an update on this new California law, and so thank you. So.
All right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Honorable Commissioners, thank you for the opportunities to speak to you this evening. What we're going to be covering is the updates in a very short summary of the 2019 Energy Code solar photovoltaic requirements. So as a brief background, every 3 years, the state of California updates the California Building Code as a 3-year cycle. And we are currently in the middle of our current cycle. And the next target enforcement date for the new building code will go into effect January 1st, 2020. And there are several items proposed in that update. One of the most kind of item that's gotten a lot of attention includes the solar photovoltaic update to the Energy Code, which essentially creates a mandatory requirement for new residential buildings. And new residential includes single-family homes, as well as a low-rise residential, which is 3 stories or less. Now, the PV sizing, so the photovoltaic sizing requirements for that building type will be based on the annual electricity load, and that the consumption is a prediction based on energy modeling software that the California Energy Commission creates. And so in particular, one item that we'd like to highlight that we are kind of researching at the moment is in regards to all-electric homes without a gas hookup. One question came up about that. What will happen in that scenario? And
Is that you're not, are you not allowed to have a house with a gas hookup, or are you I'm not, or if you don't have a gas hookup, I was.
That's a great question. That was addressed in the current version of the code, so you are, yes, allowed to have a home that without a natural gas hookup.
But you can have it the other way. You can have a gas hookup if you want.
Yes. Yes. So just for a point of clarification, the question really came up around how will this code impact all electric homes? Will it be treated differently? Yes, and will you require more PV? And the preliminary results, which are based on a research-only version of the software, says that yes, in fact, a larger PV system will likely be required on an all-electric home compared to that with gas. So that's based on our current findings. The software is currently in research-only mode, which I mentioned, and the official compliance software will be out in January of 2019, so we will know officially how those types of homes will be impacted at that point. And then there are several exceptions to this regulation, and either partial or full exceptions for residential construction, that's new residential construction, participating in community solar programs, situations where there are existing trees or hilltops or adjacent structures that would inhibit the use of solar. There are exceptions and very specific requirements about how those items would be addressed. And one other exception is homeowners who install battery storage with PV will reduce their PV requirement by up to 25%. And that's been also written into the code.
Can I just ask one question about that? So if my next door neighbor builds a new house and I want to plant a tree on my yard that might potentially grow and shade their house, am I not allowed to plant a tree?
So that's a great question. And that question actually is addressed in an earlier regulation called the 2009 Solar Shade Act, which is actually unrelated to this regulation per se, but the bottom line basically says whichever item was there first would get the precedence.
Plant fast.
So canopy for Palo Alto has to go out of business or something? I mean, that we can't plant trees?
It's like water rights. Stake your claim.
Okay. Okay, great. And then the last slide is basically just summary of impact on Palo Alto construction. So essentially, any new residential permits submitted after January 1st, 2020 will need to meet the requirements. And existing residential buildings undergoing any sort of alteration and all commercial construction will not be impacted by that requirement. So in summary, that's the update.
Is there anything in the code about the design of the roof to be optimized for solar and where the panels would be placed?
Yes, there's extensive guidance and outlines of regulations of how that is to be designed. So, and it can go on for pages and pages. So yes, there's very specific rules about designing the roof as well as situating the solar panels and where you can put them and where you cannot put them.
So a couple points came up in discussion Judith and I had yesterday with the team. One is that there are between 100 and 200 on an average year buildings that would be affected by this in Palo Alto. Now, if you take that out over 10 years, that's quite a few buildings. It starts impacting our electric load. Secondly, I continue to believe, I think most of us take the view that we'd like to get carbon neutral at the lowest possible cost, and this is a much higher cost way to do that. I think that's a defect in the law. It's a point that will be considered when staff discusses their legislative agenda, which actually is going to be next week. And right now, the law doesn't allow an exception for Palo Alto or other towns that are carbon neutral, but perhaps there'll be some changes to it, or could be. And maybe to this point on the canopy might be a good one to consider in that connection as well.
Another thing that I'd like to add is that when the commission made this plan, they were operating under the assumption that, so most of California has smart grid. We do not. So if all of the new housing that came in had to have PV put on them, we are not in a position to manage that effectively. And so one of the documents that I think it would be really useful for the staff to bring and consider in the meeting is the Voices of Experience on integrating intermittent resources that the Department of Energy put out, because we are not going to be, and I was looking at the numbers, because the timing of when our smart grid installation is going to be there is 2 years after this takes effect. So we will not be able to manage this effectively. And when you have sort of random, a few PV here and there, it's not a problem. But if you're now talking about hundreds of new ones on top of hundreds of EVs, we could find ourselves in a really difficult position. And since we're kind of a nit in the vision of California, it certainly is possible that the CEC was not thinking about Palo Alto and Lodi when they were making this ruling. So I think that we, if nothing else, need some more time to be able to comply with this. And you know, I think we can also, I think it might not be a bad idea to do an audit to see what are the locations where community solar might be possible. So even if it's more expensive, that may be the way that we have to get around it.
Can I? Commissioners, hi, my name is Christine Tam. I'm a senior resource planner in Jonathan's group, and I do wanted to speak to this solar mandates that the CEC has adopted effective January 2020. So the way that the CEC analyzed the solar mandates is based on cost effectiveness for each kilowatt hour of solar generation from the rooftop. However, when they did this cost effectiveness analysis, they look at the dominant utility, so to speak, in each climate zone. And the cost effectiveness analysis for climate zone 4, which is where Palo Alto is located, is based on PG&E's retail rates. And PG&E has much higher electric retail rates than Palo Alto. Our rates is about 50% or 60% of the PG&E retail rates. Also, Palo Alto currently has a NEM2's, a NEM successor program. So in terms of the buyback rate from the customer perspective, it's not as favorable for Palo Alto residents compared to PG&E. And this point has been pointed out, this analysis has been pointed out to the CEC staff, and the CEC staff did say that there is language in the CEC Title 24 Energy Code that allows Palo Alto to request an exemption from this solar mandates if we can demonstrate that it is not cost effective for Palo Alto residents to put rooftop solar on their homes. So this is a decision that Palo Alto needs to decide whether we go back to the CEC and make this request based on the analysis, which I actually sort of on my, from my back of the envelope analysis, it is not cost effective. But to make this request will need to be vetted here with City Council and then submitted to the CEC for their approval. And I think from a public optics perspective, it doesn't look very good because we're trying to get out of the solar mandate, which there are a lot of people who are quite excited about. So that is,
I think part of why they're excited is because they don't understand all the ramifications of what it means. So I think that, this is the feel-good idea decision where you make these decisions based on emotional advocacy and not because you understand the trade-offs. And I think it is really important for us as the UAC to give advice to the city council to not just go along with something because the optics seem nice when it's bad for customers, not helpful for the environment, and not good for our utility to be able to manage it in a responsible way. And I think that, not saying, and plus we're making, as Chair Danaher pointed out, we make a big deal about our portfolio of how much solar we have in it. And so the solar we're buying at a large scale, at bulk scale, is much more cost effective. And so if we want to do this, that we have to comply, we at least have to comply in a different way. Not to mention the whole tree thing, because I think that the idea of telling people in Palo Alto you can't plant trees on your yard is not going to be great optics either.
Christine, I really appreciate your comments. Jonathan, Dean, I know there'll be discussion of legislative agenda. It would be good, I think, if the staff could report back at a future meeting on if there are plans, strategy for seeking changes in the law that would take care of Palo Alto.
One more quick comment.
Please.
It also strikes me as a little bit odd that there's a mandate for solar, but then a sort of a reverse incentive to install that same solar if you have energy storage, as opposed to something that's simply driving towards solar with energy storage. Because the only thing that strikes me as positive for the Palo Alto community would be things that would drive us towards solar with energy storage. We do have Palo, what is it? I'm going to get it right here. Rule 27? 26?
26, I believe it is.
26, Rule 26, so that at least I would think by the time of this, we would have solar inverters that would, fight to keep the grid online for some number of cycles of the grid. But in an outage, they're then not of use. And so here we're going to have a whole bunch of new buildings in Palo Alto. They're going to be just as dark. And now you're going to have the all-electric ones that have even more solar because they're all electric. And those unfortunate people will be dark and cold. So I think I would think that, if there's a way to go back and say, and not only doesn't this make any sense for us, you're encouraging us to do an awkward thing. Why don't you instead say we need solar with energy storage, because then our community becomes more resilient, which is actually progress for us.
All right, well, since we're getting late here, we've got some long agenda items. I suggest that we move that on, but we would like to hear back from staff on this.
Absolutely.
More.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Okay. So on to the main event here, the staff recommendation that the commission recommend acceptance of the smart grid assessment and utilities technology implementation plan, including AMI. So,
Chair Danaher?
We're doing the EIR first.
So I thought we were going to do the,
okay, I misunderstood. All right, we'll go to number
Number one?
Pardon me, I skipped over that.
thank you.
EIRP plan.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'd like to introduce Jim Stack, a senior resource planner, and the lead on this project, and also his team in the audience here, Shiva Swaminathan, also a senior resource planner, and Lena Perkins, a resource planner. And there has definitely been other participation by people throughout resource management in this very extensive work effort. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, commissioners. So I'm here tonight with one of the final two presentations you're going to see on the 2018 Electric Integrated Resource Plan. As you know, we've been working on this for almost 2 years now. We've come to you many times now over the course of that period with updates on the process. At this point, we're approaching the finish line because we need to get the EIRP formally approved by the City Council by the end of the year and submit it to the state. At this point, the body of the report is basically done. We're just working on cleaning up some formatting and getting it through the review process. It's a large document, and it's fulfilling a legal requirement to the state, so we want to make sure we have all of our ducks in a row. So next month, I'll be back to present to you the full report with all the attachments and ask for your formal approval or recommendation for approval of that document. So tonight, I'll be talking to you, kind of walking you through some of the major components of the report and giving you some background on integrated resource planning and the state of the portfolio right now and where we see it going between now and 2030. But more importantly, I'll be presenting you with our proposed EIRP objectives, strategies, and work plan. And it's these three documents, which we're not planning to actually submit to the state with the EIRP, which they'll be kind of guiding us at a staff level over the next few years as we implement the EIRP. So these are the documents that we'd like to kind of focus your attention on tonight and ask for your specific feedback on. So now to the background. This.
Before we jump in, so just framing the discussion a little bit. We have a pretty extensive presentation here tonight that actually has some additional information that's going to be helpful to the discussion. We're hoping to get clarifying questions as we go through, but I'd say discussion and deep questions save towards the end, because I think there may be information that will there may be information later in the presentation that will answer some questions. I'd also note that this is a pretty extensive item, and we are coming back next month, as Jim mentioned, and so if there's a need for additional discussion, there will be time then as well.
Yeah, thank you. So this schematic here shows a visual overview of integrated resource planning, which is basically the process the utilities use to develop a roadmap for how we're going to meet our energy needs over a certain planning horizon by looking at a comprehensive set of supply side and demand side resources, and all trying to achieve our objectives related to cost and sustainability and reliability. Palo Alto has been engaged in integrated resource planning for many years. Here are just a few of the reports I found recently in our office. And the impetus for the current EIRP was SB 350, which was a major piece of legislation passed roughly 3 years ago. And what that did was it basically revamped all of our RPS requirements, renewable portfolio standard requirements, and our energy efficiency requirements. It also established formal greenhouse gas reduction targets for the electric sector, all to be accomplished by 2030. And as a means of making sure the utilities were on track to meet all these aggressive targets, the legislators imposed a requirement in SB 350 that all of the larger utilities submit a periodic integrated resource plan to state regulators so they can keep track of our progress. And they were quite specific about what they wanted to see in these documents. This is a list here of all of the elements that we're required to have in our IRPs that we submit to the CEC. And so this document, this slide shows our work plan over the past year and a half. You've seen this slide before. Since June of 2017, we've been coming to you every few months with new discussion of different parts of the report. Now we are at the second to last box on this flow chart, the one highlighted in red, where we're getting ready to seek approval. And this slide shows a list of 10 major policy questions that we laid out at the beginning of the process that we told you we'd be discussing in the EIRP. And finally, here's an exhaustive list of all the presentations we've given to you over the past year and a half related to the EIRP. So as I noted earlier, we've been doing integrated resource planning for a while, and previously, before this EIRP, we did integrated resource planning under the framework of the Long-Term Electric Acquisition Plan, or LEAP. Our last LEAP update was done in 2012, and in the past 6 years since then, a lot has changed in the electricity industry. Greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and RPS targets and energy efficiency targets have all ratcheted up. Distributed generation has proliferated, especially local solar, and we're starting to see growth in energy storage markets and electric vehicles as well. And during that time frame, CPAU has changed quite a bit as well. In the past 6 years, we've adopted a carbon neutral supply plan. Our RPS level has almost tripled. We've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. We've started a feed-in tariff program. We signed 6 new solar power purchase agreements. We've had a lot of major energy efficiency savings, and we've installed new electric vehicle chargers at city properties. And we've also adopted a new strategic plan, a new sustainability climate action plan, a local solar plan, and an electrification work plan. And in a couple of months, we'll be coming back with a distributed energy resources plan for you. This slide just shows visually how the supply portfolio has changed during that period. Essentially, we used to have a large chunk of our portfolio coming from market power purchases, which are basically from natural gas generators. And we've sort of swapped those out for new purchases from long-term renewables contracts, specifically from new solar projects operating in the Central Valley. And here are just a few more slides to illustrate the current state of the portfolio. This one shows the growth in our renewable purchases over time. And in particular, you can see the explosion of solar purchases over the past few years, as we've had 5 new projects come online during that period. And that puts our RPS level far ahead of where the state requires us to be at this point. You can also see the portfolio's greenhouse gas emissions coming down over the past few years, since 2006, when we started making renewables purchases. In 2013, they dropped down to 0 when we adopted the carbon neutral plan, and they've remained there ever since. All this, of course, assumes that we're talking about using the current methodology for carbon accounting for the portfolio, which is based on looking at our net annual volume of market purchases. And as you know, we've had a lot of discussion about that methodology and whether it's appropriate to use recently. And we'll be continuing that discussion over the next year or so, and I'll be talking about that more in a few slides. This slide also shows where the state target is for our utility in 2030. It shows you a range of values there because the state hasn't formally adopted a methodology yet, or a number for us yet, for taking the economy-wide target and bringing it down to the utility level. This slide shows a little bit more, in a little more detail, where we expect the portfolio to be in 2020, and you'll note that it includes the contribution to our overall energy needs from supply-side resources like efficiency and behind-the-meter solar. This chart shows how we project the portfolio to evolve over the course of the planning period out to 2030. You can see the wedges for landfill gas and wind decreasing as those contracts start to expire. And most importantly, you can see there's a big amount of uncertainty around the Western contract starting in 2025. That's when the Western contract expires, and that's going to be a big topic of a big area of our focus over the next few years, determining whether to renew that contract and at what capacity level. Next, this chart shows a monthly look at our load and supply resources, and you can see the imbalance between the two of those, where we have deficits in the fall and winter months and surpluses in the spring and summer months, at least in average and wet years. And finally, this chart shows a more detailed look at our load forecast between now and 2030. And it shows you the impacts that we are expecting to see to the load from various types of distributed energy resources. So you can see that electric vehicles and heat pump water and space heaters are expected to add to our load, while efficiency and behind-the-meter solar are expected to reduce our load by even more. So Overall, we're expecting our load to come down slightly from where it is now, and also compared to a business as usual scenario.
I think it's important to remind people here that that 6.6% is not a 6.6% decrease from where we are now. It's a 6.6 decrease from where we would be in 2030. So it's just a slight decrease from where we are now.
All right, so now I'll shift gears and get to the new material. And the rest of this presentation will cover our objective, strategies, and work plan under the EIRP. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the part that we'd really appreciate your feedback on tonight. So under our recently approved utility strategic plan, we adopted a new mission statement, which is shown here. And the overall objective for the EIRP is derived directly from that mission statement. And it's just tailored slightly to electric supply resources. And that is to provide safe, reliable, environmentally sustainable, and cost-effective electric resources and services to all of our customers. And in order to fulfill that objective over the next several years, we propose the following set of 9 strategies, which we also shared with you at our presentation in June. And those strategies are to pursue an optimal mix of supply-side and demand-side resources, to maintain a carbon-neutral supply, to actively manage our portfolio supply cost uncertainties, to manage our portfolio to ensure the lowest possible ratepayer bills, to partner with external agencies to implement optimization opportunities, to manage our supplies to meet changing customer loads and load profiles, to ensure reliable and low-cost transmission services, to support local electric supply resiliency, and of course to comply with all state and federal laws and regulations.
Sorry, clarifying question.
Sure.
Seems like our printout is different. As of number 5, they diverge. Is that just a versioning out of date printout?
I think that's
situation?
I think that's the situation.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so for those EIRP strategies, you can refer to attachment C, which is towards the back of your staff report. And that's also where you'll find the 7 initiatives that we're going to talk about that are the main focus for the discussion tonight.
Yeah, thank you. And as Jonathan just mentioned, attachment C includes our proposed high-level work plan that we are going to follow over the next few years. The work plan is organized around the 9 strategies that I just described to you on the previous slide. And under each of the 9 strategies, we have a description of some of the activities that we plan to pursue in order to carry out each strategy. And those include some of our usual ongoing activities that we're doing currently, as well as a set of new projects or initiatives that we're proposing to embark on. And the new initiatives that we're proposing are listed here on this slide, and I'll walk through them individually on subsequent slides here. So the first new initiative is to evaluate the merits of a new 30-year Western contract, and this was the major topic of our presentation to you back in June, so I won't rehash everything that we discussed, but as you know, the Western-based resource contract is the largest single resource in our portfolio. It supplies almost 40% of our energy needs in an average year. The current contract expires at the end of 2024. So within the next year and a half, we have to make a decision about whether to renew that contract for a new 30-year period, and if so, at what level, at what capacity level. Over the years, Western has been a very good resource for us. It's been a very low-cost resource. But looking forward, with all the new renewables online right now, pushing market prices down, it doesn't look quite as attractive as it used to. And on top of that, you have to consider the large amount of uncertainty around the resource's output from month to month and from year to year. And also there are a host of longer-term uncertainties around the cost of this resource, as well as the level of output that we'll receive from it going forward. And most of those are related to various environmental regulations being considered by the state and by the federal government.
And climate change, right?
And climate change, of course, yes. So as part of our report in June, we did some analysis of the net value of a renewed Western contract. Essentially, we compared the expected cost of the resource with the value we would expect to receive from the output of that resource. And we also compared the numbers for Western to a variety of different types of resources that we could pursue or we could contract with if we decided not to renew our Western contract for the full allocation. And this chart basically summarizes that analysis. Western is the blue line here, and it appears to have basically the highest expected net value of all the resources that we evaluated at this point, except possibly for new in-state wind resources. We don't expect very many new in-state wind projects to be available to us in the next few years. However, the big caveat here is that we show some very large uncertainty bands around the expected value here for Western, and that's related to the uncertainty that I just mentioned around the cost and the output of that resource. So a lot of our work over the next few years will be to try to narrow down that uncertainty band and get a better sense of what the actual cost and value of the resource will be going forward. We'll also be focused on negotiating the contract language with Western in the next year, and we'll be trying to build in some flexibility into that contract so that if the resource doesn't turn out to be a good value for us after we renew our contract, we'll be able to hopefully get out of the contract. The second new initiative is related to rebalancing, evaluating the merits of rebalancing the supply portfolio to more closely match load with resources. So this is very closely related to the first initiative in that if we decide to get out of our Western contract or not renew it or renew it for a smaller amount, we'll have a big opportunity to rebalance the portfolio with new types of resources. So this was also a major topic of our June presentation, and this slide here, which I showed earlier, just shows again our monthly load and resource balance in an average hydro year. And on this slide, we're showing you a daily look at the load and resource balance over one particular 24-hour period in each quarter of the calendar year. So you can see that from season to season, our load profile doesn't change very significantly, but our supply portfolio, our supply profile certainly does. You can see that in the fall and winter months, we have significant deficits across most periods of the day. And in the spring and summer months, we have large surpluses across many hours, especially in the afternoon when solar is generating. And this is all based on the assumption that we dispatch our hydro resources in order to maximize their value, so based on market price signals rather than to match load with supply. As part of our analysis from the June report, we looked at the generation profiles of a number of different types of resources, and this graph shows daily generation profiles for a variety of resources across the 12 months of the year. You can see that hydro and solar generation kind of exacerbate the imbalance between our load and our supply because they generate the most during the spring and summer during the afternoons. Meanwhile, there are some other resources, particularly out-of-state wind, which may actually be complementary to our current profile because they generate a little bit more in the winter and the fall. So we're planning to continue examining this issue over the coming year or two, and it'll be largely done in coordination with our analysis of the Western contract renewal decision. The third initiative is to evaluate how best to utilize the COTP transmission asset starting in 2024. COTP stands for the California-Oregon Transmission Project. It's a transmission resource that connects California with Southern Oregon, which is part of the Bonneville Power Administration that covers most of the Pacific Northwest. The city owns a 50-megawatt share of this project, which we laid off for 15 years back in 2008. So we'll be getting it back in 2024. at which point it'll be debt-free, so we'll only be responsible for paying the O&M costs associated with using the resource. It's also potentially a way for us to import some low-cost wind resources, for example, from the Pacific Northwest into California. However, we still need to do a more thorough examination of all of the potential uses for this resource and decide whether it makes the most sense to use the resource ourselves or lay it off for another period, or turn it over to the ISO and collect revenue from other utilities using it. The fourth initiative is to evaluate various methods of accounting for the supply portfolio's carbon content and to consider updating the definition of carbon neutrality. This is another topic that we've discussed at length recently, including again in our June report. It's also closely related to the second initiative about portfolio rebalancing. Essentially, the issue here is that we're currently calculating the portfolio's emissions based on looking at the net annual volumes of market power purchases. However, the carbon content associated with market power on the grid varies significantly over the course of the year and over the course of a single day. This chart kind of illustrates that. It shows the marginal grid emissions factor of the grid for each hour across the 4 different quarters of the year. So a lower number here means a cleaner grid, less carbon in the grid electricity. Basically, you can see that throughout the year, grid electricity is cleaner during the daytime when solar is generating, and it's dirtier at night. It's also cleaner during the spring and summer months when there's more solar and hydro on the grid, and it's dirtier during the winter and fall months. And what that means for Palo Alto is that during the periods where we have surplus supplies that we're selling to the grid, we're selling those supplies into a relatively clean grid. And when we're deficit, we have deficits to fill. We're buying electricity from a more dirty grid. And that means that it's possible that we may not be displacing as much carbon with our surplus supplies as we are generating from our deficits. And the next table kind of illustrates that point. It shows that for 2018, even though we're projecting to have an overall surplus over the course of the year of 62 gigawatt hours of generation, our surplus supplies are going to be displacing 63,000 metric tons of carbon, whereas our purchases from the grid will be causing emissions of 68,000 metric tons of carbon. So that means that overall our portfolio would be responsible for 5,000 metric tons on a net basis over the course of the year. Still, this is much lower than what we expect our state requirement to be for 2030, which is 73,000 metric tons of CO2. And this slide just shows again the different generation profiles of different types of resources that we could contract for that might be complementary and help us receive more generation from during the dirtier periods. Now, so we're planning to discuss the topic of carbon accounting methodology and the carbon neutral definition with you over the coming year or so, and particularly in the context of the portfolio rebalancing discussion as well. But we're a little bit hesitant to get too far out in front on this issue, and basically the reason that we're not coming forward with a recommendation right now to change our methodology is that the state is currently undertaking 3 separate initiatives where they're looking at this exact issue. And we don't really want to get out in front of them and then have to backtrack a few months later if they go a different direction from us. So, for example, the Air Resources Board is working on a methodology for the 2030 scoping plan where they're going to be allocating the economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions targets down to the individual utility level. The CEC is looking at different methodologies for calculating our emissions factor for reporting on our power content label, because under AB 1110, we're required to report, each utility is required to report an emissions factor on our 2020 power content label covering the 2019 calendar year. Meanwhile, the CPUC has already adopted a new methodology for their utilities, the investor-owned utilities and community choice aggregators, for them to use in their IRPs that they submit to the CPUC. and that's called the clean net short methodology, which is sort of a more complicated version of the hourly calculation that I was sort of alluding to earlier. So we're planning to keep discussing this issue and also kind of keep track of where the state goes in these different proceedings as well. The fifth initiative is to evaluate the merits of monetizing our excess RPS supplies and consider different approaches to achieving RPS compliance. So we had a preliminary discussion about this last December with you, and you provided feedback to us that you'd like to see us focus on cost minimization and by selling our excess RPS supplies and potentially swapping some of our high-value Bucket 1 resources for lower-cost Bucket 3 resources. So we're planning to come back to you early next year with some analysis about different options for pursuing that approach and the financial impacts of those different possibilities. And I'll just note finally that one source of uncertainty related to this initiative may be resolved for us in the next couple of weeks because last week the legislature approved SB 100. So if the governor signs that in the coming days, which we think is likely, that we'll finally know for sure what our ultimate RPS targets will be by 2030, we think. So this graph again just shows our renewable energy purchases over time, and the lines indicate the volumes of renewable energy that we need to satisfy the 50% or 60% by 2030 RPS requirements. So you can see roughly what the volume of surplus supplies we are expecting to have over the coming years that we could shift around.
Sorry, quick clarifying question on the previous slide. How does SB 100 define clean energy?
I think we'll have to get back to you on that. It might be a little bit muddy. I believe it includes large hydro. That's our understanding at this point. I think it's basically renewables and large hydro, but we'll have to confirm that. Initiative number 6 is to explore synergistic opportunities to work with NCPA and other agencies. So I'll just say that there are many more public power agencies operating in California today than there were just a few years ago with all the new community choice aggregation agencies that have started operating recently. Many of these agencies kind of share a similar set of values and objectives as we do in Palo Alto, and we may find ways to work collaboratively with them. That might include simply just transacting with them directly. It might include operating some joint customer programs with them. So we'll be exploring those options in the coming years. And finally, initiative number 7 is to undertake a competitive assessment of the electric utility within the context of the proliferation of customer-sited DER technologies, and to develop contingencies to address the potential for large changes in load as a result of DER adoption. DERs, as you know, have the potential to substantially alter the magnitude and the shape of the load that we serve. And so this initiative is to examine the impacts of these changes on the utility and figure out how to best position ourselves to and advance these changes. And so that brings us to the end of our list of new projects. So at this point, we're ready to entertain any questions you have or receive any feedback you have. Thank you.
Jim, thank you for an excellent presentation. Why don't we start at that end, or who's ever ready? Or
I did think it was an excellent presentation. It was very helpful to me. I think the slides are really helpful, and they really dramatize for me this whole problem of matching our resources with our load. And I know that that's something you're focused on, but this was helpful to remind me that that's a major issue.
I think I certainly appreciate the hard work and attention to detail required to figure out a plan like this. The one piece that keeps coming back and hurting my brain is how can we actually think our load stays flat or goes down? If we're electrifying houses. So home heating over time becomes electrified. Vehicles are becoming electrified. And it strikes me that we're probably only one happy accident away from the next Google deciding that they want to build data center type operations right here in Palo Alto, where they have very little latency, so that, I don't know what, we all have self-driving vehicles. And data centers are 10, 20, 50 megawatt loads. So this is the only part of it that I struggle with is this part, because it strikes me as very possible, if not likely, that our electric load goes up while our overall, perhaps our overall energy load reduces if we're using less natural gas. But that's the part that bothers me.
I'll let my colleague Lena Perkins address that. She's been mainly responsible for our load forecasting for this process.
Good evening, Commissioners. It is surprising on the face of it when we look at all the vehicles and other loads we're hoping to electrify with additional renewables. It is consistent with statewide projections. And the main drivers are really the codes and standards in energy efficiency, both in buildings and across the board in appliances, that even with this is a very aggressive projection for EVs, it's not enough to compensate for that, as well as the decreasing manufacturing and industrial loads. And just as a side note, we're revisiting this forecast right now. The CEC, when they actually disaggregated their forecast for POUs, so for all public utilities to make a Palo Alto specific forecast, and they have our load dropping from today's load approximately 10 to 15% over the same time interval. So that's something that we are going back and forth with them about, but it's consistent across utilities. One of the reasons that EPRI is so excited about electrification, EPRI, the Electric Resource Institute, electrification and EVs, is because we have seen flat loads for so long, and now we are seeing declining loads across basically the nation.
I think it might be an interesting
Commissioner.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. The one thing I'd also add is it's easy to forget that Palo Alto has 20% residential load and 80% commercial. And so even if you have a large increase in residential load due to EVs and electrification, it doesn't dramatically increase the load citywide.
And to your data center point, we became aware of about 2.5 megawatts of data centers leaving, I believe for Silicon Valley Power, Santa Clara's municipal utility. So that's in a point of context.
Yeah, Silicon Valley Power is more the location that they show up. Frankly, a data center like that would be fantastic. There are a lot of benefits to having large data centers like that, but they tend to be outside of Palo Alto.
Well, I think it might be interesting to run the numbers where you just electrify all the vehicles and electrify all the houses, because if doubling 20%, because if you electrify all the vehicles, you double the household load, and if you then make heating electric, heating is a lot of kilowatt hours. I just have a hard
It's an
time.
interesting point. I mean, and it's something that we can run as a sensitivity case.
Yeah,
One thing, we're not electrifying with resistance heaters, right? So it's not apples to apples, but point taken.
Yeah, but even if you're heat pumping, you still need to add the watts to the water, and you still need to add the watts to the air. So, we've talked through the leverage of heat pumping. You're still, even with your multiplication factors you get from heat pumping, it's not free energy. You're going to pull the power from somewhere. When you're looking all the way out to 2030, having load go down by 6%, and also talking about it's hard for me to grasp.
Yeah, I mean, even if you just double residential load, that's only 15% of our load, right? When we're seeing, so now we're 15% higher. So I take your point. I think it's worth looking at, and we can come back to you with some bookend scenarios on that.
To Arnie's point, there's also the possibility of more commuters charging at work.
Yeah, the trend is the opposite direction because of the long-range vehicles. So about 80% plus of charging happens at home. So
I think your points are well taken, though. We need to consider the possibility of significant increases as well as decreases in our load and try to build in flexibility into our portfolio to the extent that we can, and plan for that uncertainty when we make new commitments. Nope, thanks very much.
Thanks for thinking about these various things. So have you thought about blockchain, which is like the buzzword of the industry these days that would use up a lot of power? I mean, seriously, because it's like on everybody. I mean, I have to admit I'm not a big blockchain fan, but have you considered that in your calculations?
Are you referring to Bitcoin mining?
I'm sorry, have I referred to what?
Are you referring to Bitcoin mining?
Well, they're not calling it Bitcoin mining, but yeah, they're calling it blockchain, but yeah.
yeah, the proof of work model for blockchain, where you have to do a certain number of flops to solve a problem. It's right up there with marijuana growth in terms of potential growth for the industry. It is not something we've considered in any of our scenarios to date.
Okay, so the thing that I would like to really request that we add are some charts that really get into this idea of coincident and non-coincident demand. I would really like it that everybody on the UAC understands what that is, that everybody on the city council understands what that is, and when you say it to people in Palo Alto, that they understand what it is, because I am really concerned when I look at things like the power content label, okay, and I think we have had a tremendous impact on the growth of CCAs, where there are all these companies that are going out there blowing the same smoke and not talking about coincident demand. And when I've talked to people from CCAs, they get very defensive and they say to me, well, it'd be too complicated to explain to people that. And so I think that we are doing, as I've said before, the community a disservice by pretending that the lights that are on now are coming from electrons that are zero carbon. I just do not believe that people understand the subtle difference between the carbon neutral portfolio and that everything is powered by zero carbon renewables. I think it is naive to think that people get the difference. I just don't believe that that's what's going on. And so I think coincident demand, that's one thing that I really want us to include in this so that the truth is good enough. Okay, so that's one thing. And because again, if we're going to walk the talk, then let's get geothermal. Let's, if this is really what we care about as a community, let's bite the bullet, pay for it, and really do it. And I'm okay if we want to discuss that. But I think that we need to not be pretending. The other thing that I think as we talk about storage, I think that it would be also as part of the IRP would be really useful to look at bulk storage options, not just batteries, but thermal storage and other kinds of things that could be done at the utility level so that we could be sucking up all the solar that we can generate and other people are generating that is they're paying to have people take, and see if we can't hold that in such a way that we can actually use that. And so there are technologies available that would allow that to happen. And I think as we look at if the IRP door is going to close, and this is going to be what we talk about till 2030, then I'd like to make sure that that is included in the discussion, because I think, again, from a public safety standpoint, we haven't seen yet analysis if we're dependent on having people have batteries in their houses, okay? What happens when there's a fire and you know, the neighbor that I wasn't allowed to plant the tree for, you know, his house blows up because he's got 3 big batteries in his house and his 2 EVs in the driveway, and they have a major fire, and now my house is gone because it got blown up because nobody wanted to talk about the safety factor. So I think if we're looking at storage, we really need to look at it not just as personal storage being done by a few people, but rather what we really want to do to walk the talk. And we've used the argument that it hasn't been cost effective, and that's true, that it hasn't been, but as there are more technologies becoming available, I think we need to consider that as part of the equation also.
A couple thoughts. On the new initiatives, evaluating the merits of a 30-year Western contract, I'm struck every time the Western project is discussed by how we are still talking about an average hydro year. And I would be much more interested in the new normal and the new average. I mean, I realize none of us has a crystal ball, but it seems the one thing I think are fairly certain is that hydro in the future will not look like it did in the past. And I appreciate the wide uncertainty bands on the graph on page 4, I guess it's slide 28. But it just seems like the blue line should be lower as our, you know, sort of main indicator of what to expect out of the Western project, and if there's a way to capture the, you know, expectations about the effects of climate change on less precipitation and it falling as rain and not snow and greater variability, that would make it easier for me to sort of reason about the value of the Western contract.
I would point out that we recently redid our long-term forecast for Western, and we reduced our expected level by about 10%.
Oh, okay.
Based on
Is that
recent-
reflected in these graphs?
It is, yes.
So when it says Western dash average year, that average year is in fact forward, some sort of forward.
Yeah, based on the recent, like 15 years or so of data.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. And I appreciate initiative number 2, rebalancing the portfolio to more closely match load with resources. And my only thought would be, I think, I hope that doesn't mean balancing our load just to Palo Alto, but, you know, looking at the wider California grid as it seems to be from slide 33. I guess to me, 2 and 4 seem to be slightly similar in spirit. And I just want to say it's great that we're looking again at our carbon accounting and what it means to be carbon neutral. And that matching load with resources seems to be a part of that. Yeah, and I would also, I mean, I think basically it's a good list of initiatives, and I look forward to, you know, seeing what comes out of them. I would stop there.
I want to echo Judith's comments about energy storage. It's coming down a lot. There's really starting to see a lot more commercial deployment on this. Jonathan and Dean, I mentioned yesterday, Colorado's Xcel just announced, you know, record low price for solar plus storage of $36 per megawatt, I guess. and I'm aware of new technologies in development. And so in this time period that we're talking about, it's going to become much more cost effective than it's been. And I think it should be it's relevant to most of your slides. Yeah, I agree with the points that you've already noted that the water resource is going to be at risk. That also affects geothermal. A lot of the geothermal plants in the state are operating way below rated capacity because those are correlated resources, not on an hourly basis, but on an annual basis. But anyways, I think this is an excellent plan, and it's going to be really interesting to hear the more detailed reports as we have going forward. Any further comments from folks? All right. Jonathan and
So when we come back next month, is there any particular topics you wanted to come back to or see us address a little bit more?
Coincident and non-coincident demand. I mean, I really want us to be, that we're all on the same page talking about this stuff and reality-based. I think that would be something that we could make a major contribution to the state, to the country, and to the industry if we really had an intelligent conversation about what really is going on there and look at the alternatives in ways that are rational. You know, it's just, there's more than one way you can do it, but I think, you know, one of the things that we're seeing is we're going to get some market destabilization, and that's the part that worries me, that, you know, Enron, we had lots of smart people that contributed to what happened with Enron, okay? And having the whole market blow apart, and I think if we put all the independent power producers and all the merchant plants out of business, you know, the natural gas plants, because people are making these pronouncements, and it's easy for a legislator who doesn't have to actually deliver power to anybody to make, oh, I want 100% renewables. You know, that's not his job to make it real. It's your job. And what's going to happen when people go to flip the switch at night and, oh, the solar doesn't turn it on at night? What happened? Because we destabilize the markets. And I think this is one of the things where you're hearing other states talking about, we don't want to be like California. You know, you look at the ISO New England, they have on their app, they have, you know, what the generation mix is at any given time. You can look and see at any given moment. And, you know, it's not solar at night. You know, and so I think that we have to be, that would be something that we have, that we should be contributing to in a positive part of the discussion, okay? I just think that needs to be an important part of it, and not just the aspirational piece.
all right, thank you. Anybody else?
A suggestion on that point. If you take your page 33 slide and you lay our load quarter by quarter on top of that, you then see okay, and you probably have that cool graph, right? But then you see that, or you could take the other one that Lisa was talking about on page 30, and you can show, well, what resources do we fill in those voids with? And of course, they're natural gas-fired and coal-fired energy sources during those gap periods. I think that'd be valuable, because then the whole conversation around energy storage starts to have value, and cost-effective is measured in different ways. Cost-effective against what? If what we want is zero carbon, well, it's really cost-effective, because now you can take that huge hydro peak and you can store it when you want to, or you can take local solar and store it locally. Whereas when if we don't portray the value, it's really hard for all of us to see why that's great, because we don't. I think when it just looks like a gap in the curve, we don't really know where that's coming from. You don't know that it's coming from Moss Landing, right, which is natural gas fired.
Perhaps a discussion for another time would be carbon offsets. They do have value. So, and sometimes that may be a more cheap way to get to the result we want. All right.
But carbon offsets don't happen at the same time of day, and that's the point we're trying to make. Carbon offsets are also happening in the daytime when we don't need them. The point we're trying to make is we have a nighttime problem, and we can use nighttime technologies to solve the nighttime problem.
No, I understand and I agree with your statement on that. I think it's still to be considered. Do you do more for the planet, putting $1 million into preserving rainforest than into storage for nighttime? I don't know the answer, but I want to make sure we keep open minds as we think about our solutions.
Yeah.
Is it okay with the commission if we go on to the next agenda item? Oh,
Can I just express an interest in getting a little bit more information about the COTP transmission asset? I would love to understand that better.
Good point.
Sure.
Good point. All right. Jim and team, thank you. Excellent report. Really good.
Thank you very much.
All right. So we're a little behind schedule. We'll see how long this item 2 takes. Staff recommendation that the UAC recommend acceptance of the technology implementation plan and AMI. Shiva, welcome back.
I'd introduce Shiva Swaminathan, our Senior Resource Planner, who's been leading the charge on AMI. Just remind commissioners, this was a continuation of a discussion from last month, and it was, I'm sorry, it was last month, or was it the month before?
May.
God, time flies. Continuation of a discussion in May. I know several commissioners weren't here. I'm hoping that everybody has the report available from May, and we will just do a brief presentation and then get straight to the discussion, the Q&A.
Thank you, John. Shiva Swaminathan, Senior Resource Planner. So as John mentioned, in May, we had an extensive discussion. The staff report from May is attached to your UAC report, but the broader consultant report is, you have to refer back to your May packet. So I have a brief presentation, just to say that we framed this, the AMI discussion within the broader context of technology projects. There are 3 technology projects, major technology projects underway. That is the city's enterprise resource planning system, the customer information system, which is a billing system, and the AMI. And those 3 major projects have to be coordinated, and that's part of the technology plan, which you saw consultants produced about 3 or 4 months ago. And so within that context, there is this AMI discussion, and the report you saw in May categorized these discussions along these 9 subject areas. And just to recap, we quantified the benefits which you see up here, and there were some other non-quantifiable benefits, qualitative benefits, which also are numerous. And then we came up with a net present value framework for investment over 18 to 20-year period, and we found it to be net present value neutral. Net present value of 0, which on the left side is the expenses, which categorize into 2 categories: the operating expenses, about $27 million over 18 years, and a capital expenditure of $17 million. And to the right, you see the benefits accruing over a period of 18 years. The benefits are 2 major kinds. One is operational benefits with meter reader and customer service related expense reduction, and the other is what energy savings accruing at customer premises. Those are the 2 major cost benefit categories. So based on this is what the recommendation was, but we did a sensitivity analysis. What if some of these costs increase and the benefits decrease? What's the impact?
Chief, excuse me, one clarification. So these benefits do not include the benefit of expanding the time of use billing system, and do not include more aggressive or new creative demand response approaches?
The demand response, yes. The time of use rate, no.
Okay.
So demand response, reduction in capacity, the coincident capacity we're talking about in the summer is accounted for.
Thank you.
And then the ability to influence the load with smart meters to charge at the right time, those types of benefits were too hard to quantify. Those are not part of this quantification. So we just did a sensitivity of, so what you see in green here is the expected customer bill impact, which is neutral, but then it's a wide range depending on the outcomes of these cost sensitivities. What you see in red is an adverse outcome where the operating expenditure is projected to be about 40% higher. That's we need more staff to operate these systems, and then higher capital cost, coupled with the savings are lower than anticipated. In those adverse scenario, which is shown in red, the bill impact is about 1 to 2%. In the more beneficial case, where the costs are lower and the benefits are higher than projected, then the impact is a favorable 0.5% reduction. So they just to show a range to provide perspective. But overall, looking at the analysis and the findings, we recommend that we go ahead in making this investment over the next 5 years and begin operations. But it should be coordinated with other plans as the CIS and the ERP. So that's a brief outline.
So what we're asking for from you tonight is recommending acceptance of the plan, not necessarily approval. The specific approvals about budgets, contracts, these will come individually to the council through the budget process. Essentially, what this is an indication that the general roadmap that we're looking to pursue for AMI is acceptable to the UAC and council. And I also understand that there may have been some interest in finding a way to represent the UAC's position precisely to the Finance Committee and Council through the form of a letter. And so any direction that we can get from the commission on how to provide that letter for you to provide to the commission would be greatly appreciated.
So does that need to take the form of a colleague's memo? Is that the way that we need to do it?
Let's have discussion first, get people's views, and before we get to that. Who would like to start with comments or questions? Do you want to start at your end again, AC?
Last time we had this discussion, I was concerned about the kind of the uncertainties around the sensitivity analysis. The slide that you had tonight, which was, I think, new, was helpful. Although I noticed that the expected outcomes in each case is at the bottom of the range, the kind of the sensitivity range. So I'm not completely comfortable with that, but based on the other discussion we've had tonight about kind of the increased importance of distributed energy resources. I mean, how does the AMI interact with that?
Yes, there are 3 or 4 ways. One is as a customer invests in distributed energy resources, to the extent it's beneficial to the grid, we must be able to compensate them on a differential basis, whether electric vehicle charging or a storage, to the extent it's beneficial not only to them but to the grid, we have to compensate them. So that's the AMI meters help with that. The other is impact on the distribution grid itself, to the extent incentivizing EVs to charge at a particular time, perhaps at night, so that it reduces the adverse impact on the distribution grid as opposed to the transmission grid. So different price signals, and to the commercial customers, again, implementing time of use rates. So those were the kind of the areas. And then integration of with the ISO, to the extent ISOs has tying the batteries, to the extent there are batteries at customer premises, to try to tie in those batteries and respond to some other signal other than the customer's own preference, to better integrate renewables. So those are kind of the three areas.
So that's helpful to me, and just reinforces to me the kind of the importance of the AMI if we're really moving in the direction we seem to be moving.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt the commissioner questions for a moment. We did get a speaker card. I neglected from Herb Borak to address this meeting. Hello, Herb.
Thank you, Chair Danaher, and good evening, Commissioners. I had just some informational questions related to the smart meters replacing the current meters, and also of the backhaul, how that operates, and also the extent of what's needed in the back office. That is, the current billing methods are not based upon the kinds of collections that we've made in a smart meter, and how are those figured in, or to what extent they're figured into these financial estimates. First, are there customers who don't want to have all that information collected, and will they have the alternate of not having a smart meter? Second, in terms of security, people feel that although it's not that amount of bandwidth, that it's more secure if it was fiber rather than using the radio. And that also gets into whether the backhaul is a private company, and the example that was given is Verizon rather than the city. And from that, I would ask then, how close or how to the radio transmitters that's going to be connected to the backhaul, and does that fiber system need to be? I mean, how many hops can the data take, and would it be aided by the proposal that's going in tandem? It always seems to me much slower, which is the fiber to the premises system. And I think those are the kinds of things in terms of usage and customer acceptance, and the extent to which we rely upon our own infrastructure, or whether we need to be going to a private company. And that gets to the point of showing favoritism for one company over another, because the city right now is doing a request for proposal. It's reviewing the responses, and some of members of the commission may have participated in that review of the 5 responders, and you'd be picking someone for that, and then is we picking somebody else whose backhaul we might be using. And those are the general kinds of things that I'd be interested in. Thank you.
All right. Shiva, do you want to comment on the opt-out, how it's been handled elsewhere?
Sure. This is industry has studied this trend, and the thought is, yes, customers who would not like to have a smart meter would not get a smart meter. And the cost of manual meter reading is typically charged to the customer. And I think that's the structure we are contemplating, but numbers have not been thought through.
Okay, and then very briefly, how much, or is it too early to answer the question, how much of this do you think will rely or interconnect with the city's fiber plant?
So the fiber is definitely an option. but it'll be only at the backhaul nodes, which may be about 50 locations.
Okay.
So that's definitely a option. We're not ruling that out, but it's not at the premise. It's at the backhaul at the collector level.
Okay. All right, that's good. I don't want to get into too many technical details, and you're welcome to talk to Shiva offline. We are fortunate that people have been implementing these systems for 20 years, and we're really a latecomer, so we get the advantages of tried and true technology to all of this. So Herb, thank you for the questions. Let's go back to Commissioner comments. Terry, Lisa, how about you? Judith?
So one of the publications that DOE is working on right now is Voices of Experience. What are the benefits and additions that people have been utilities have been able to achieve having AMI data? So these are what's coming out of these discussions is that what utilities thought they were going to get at the beginning of the process and what they ended up getting was so much more. And so we're going to have the advantage. This publication is being released in October. And what I think we can do, if you want, is that you guys can review it in process so that if there's something that you want to have an answer to, that you don't have, that they can go and get an answer for that and have it in the publication. So that's something that can definitely occur. I think it is very important to go to Herb's comment about the customer buy-in. One of the things that has been very consistent is that in jurisdictions in various places, there are techniques that are very effective to getting people to get their questions answered, and so people are not worried and people are okay. And then there are techniques that get people with their pitchforks out. And so, this is, again, not something that we have to reinvent the wheel. We know what works to get the pitchforks out, and we know what works to get buy-in. And having opt-out is absolutely something that should be their day one, from my perspective, as a policy, that there should be, reassure people that there will be a policy to opt out, that if you don't want to do it, and we'll come up with a reasonable price for what it will be to get your meter read. I want to address the idea of security. So there is an industry-created standard, not standard, but a voluntary code of conduct called DataGuard. And as a disclaimer, I'm working with DOE on promoting the idea of DataGuard, but if basically it aligns with what are the information access and privacy concerns that the California PUC has set for the state and all for the IOUs, and it also is the same. It gets you all set up for being able, if you were a technology company, to do business in Europe. Okay, with the privacy standards that are there. So again, it is very easy and a straightforward thing that it's a little premature in the sense that we don't have anything to protect at this point, but the energy usage information that people have can be kept private. It's, again, something that we can do. I think that it would behoove us to adopt what are the gold standards and the best practices, and have that be a policy that we say we want to make sure that our rollout is done in the best possible way, because we know it can be done well. We know that from what we've seen in the conversations on Nextdoor and Palo Alto Online, that people are concerned about cell towers and repeaters, and what is that going to mean? Am I going to get brain cancer from it? And the thing where people are nervous, there are not only sort of a lot of resources available that can help reassure people, but at a block party I was at this weekend, it turns out there's a gentleman who's in my neighborhood who worked on the defense side, these really heavy-duty communication technology. And so we have people in the community who can help reassure people that this is something that really is relatively minor. And I think we can take advantage of that. And I think we can do, we have the opportunity to do a phenomenal rollout that really looks at what are the best things that can be obtained by this. And I think from the standpoint of our body, that I would like to see us committing to educating ourselves. And so one of the things we talked about on the call is that I'll be glad to work with staff to put together a list of publications and videos that are easy to understand. Okay, so one of the reasons I asked that the ABB video be sent to all of you was that I thought it, commercial part aside for ABB, I thought it did a really nice job of just explaining how all the pieces could fit together. So there are materials that if you guys will commit to it, we can all be educated about it, about what are the opportunities and limitations of what it can and can't do. I'm not trying to say it's going to solve all our problems or whatever, but we really can make very measured judgments about where we want to make the investments and what will be some of the things that will be possible if we're willing to commit as a group to just sort of understand what we're talking about.
So Commissioner Schwartz, so I totally agree with you. I think the thing as well as with Herb is that there's a lot of concerns out there with customers, and it has to do with EMFs, it has to deal with the security aspects of it. How do we secure that all that information that's going to be floating around out there? So I can assure you, we've had some conversations about this, is that the most important thing is before this even rolls, it has to have a great communication plan that's going to have to go out to all the residents and even to the businesses as well, to explain to them really what the benefits are to the program, as well as just information. So it's almost like Q&A, as well as other information, holding some after-hour meetings with, with the residents, whoever else would want to be in those, to just explain to them so they're a little bit more at ease, because we understand that when you are going to roll this out to 70,000 meters, there's going to be a lot of insurity and so we have to do the best we can to get out in front of it before we even do anything. And I think with the timing aspect that we have, we have approximately 3 years before we actually throw a meter in somewhere. So I think that there's plenty of time to look at these things and look at best practices, because as Commissioner Danaher said, technology has been around for 20 years. There's a lot of utilities, small, large, that have actually done this. And so there's a lot of learning lessons. And so we need to make sure that we don't fall into those traps.
And I think that, and this was why the sequence of what we talked about tonight was so important, because to enable all these other things, we need this infrastructure. And so if I'd say there was the single biggest mistake that utilities made, was they made it about the meter. It's not the meter. It's like saying the internet is about your router, okay? What's valuable about the internet is all the things you can do as a result of having access to it. You just need a router to be able to do it. Okay, and I think that this idea of, if we have an appetite in town for having distributed energy resources, of having more information, of people being able to be better users and more responsible users of the resources they have, whether it be water, gas, electricity, that these are just enabling technologies that make these other things that people want to do or are required to do by law possible. Okay, right. So they're not important as the meter, they're important as all the other things we want to do with it.
Right.
All right, thank you. Arnie or AC, any comments? So when we first discussed this as a group, I think there was pretty strong support from the commission for implementing the AMI infrastructure. And Councilmember Phil said we want to make sure the council understands that the UAC does strongly recommend this. And so perhaps your advice on how best to communicate that. We could adopt a resolution here, just leave it in the minutes, send a memo from our view, or come to a meeting. Come to a meeting. What do you think?
Come to a meeting. 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 Come to a meeting
Or does it matter? Is it going to be uncontroversial?
My guess is it's not going to be controversial because the numbers work, right?
Okay.
As long as the numbers work, I don't think it's going to be controversial.
Okay. I think the numbers understate the benefits. They leave out a lot of the benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say because I remember the last time we discussed this, there was actually a fair amount of discussion about the numbers and the concern that the sort of like best case scenario was it pencils out.
Right.
But the NPV is possibly $7 million in the hole. And for me, I think it's important to sort of point out to council that there's a lot of value which isn't in the business case, and that's I'm personally inclined to favor it even if it costs us $7 million. We sort of spend money on things that are of value to the city all the time, and I think that's important to point out that it shouldn't hinge on the business case in and of itself, because a lot of the value is not quantifiable that way.
Sure, and that's clear. But if the business case is uncontroversial, that makes it easier.
Okay.
Then you don't have to weigh those things against each other.
Well, council members, is it all right if we ask the minutes reflect that the commission, pardon me, not council, didn't want to promote ourselves, that all of us strongly endorse the AMI proposal?
I think we're actually looking for a motion to recommend
there's a motion. All right.
acceptance.
Forgot this was not just discussion.
Yeah, I think that's normal practice, is you would recommend it. Right?
Okay. So is there a motion to approve the right?
So moved.
Second?
I second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Okay. This will be very exciting as we move forward on this. I wish we weren't at the trail end of the industry, trailing end, but this will be good. The last agenda item is the selection of topics for, thank you, Shiva, again, for this. Selection of topics for future meetings. There's more work stream here than is more work in progress than is shown on this, and we're not desperate for new topics despite the blanks on the schedule. We did talk yesterday with Ed, and the staff is doing a lot on charging systems, and will report to us about that analysis at some point. They'll come up and put that on the calendar. Were you about to say something, Tony?
Okay, if I share a couple things that aren't on the rolling calendar that will make their way on in the next month or two.
Please.
So we have multiple cost of service studies in progress right now. So as we start to make a little progress on those will start to pop up on the calendar. We have also all of the financial forecasting discussions that aren't on the calendar yet, but are going to fill up a substantial portion of next spring. Those are the main things, but they will fill up a lot of the empty spots on the calendar.
All right. And then reports on follow-ups and what we've been talking about this evening, I'm sure. So
there's been a lot of allusions tonight to the improvements in storage and energy storage and costs coming down. It would be helpful to me if we could hear some more about that at some point.
all right, maybe in connection with the Energy Integrated Resource Plan discussions, when we get further reports during the course of next year, we can include more in energy storage in that. Good point. All right. Is there anything else? Is there a motion to adjourn? Adjourn. All in favor? All right. Thank you.